So this week we're also taking a look at the philosopher Schopenhauer, who comes along about 100 years after Kant or so, and he has a very similar sort of diagnosis about just what beauty and the sublime are, but he's got his own little kind of dark spin on the whole thing. So Schopenhauer starts out from the viewpoint that as human beings, you and I, we pretty much spend most of our time in deep despair because we are just these big roiling balls of desire and want. There's always stuff that we're trying to get, that we want, that we desire, and most of the time our desires are just not fulfilled. And Kant says, or not Kant, Schopenhauer says, even when our desires are fulfilled, that just usually leaves us to form new desires, which then become unsatisfied. And that's why Schopenhauer thinks, in general, human life is pretty miserable, because we always feel like we're lacking something, and as soon as we get that, well, then we feel like we're lacking something else. We're always in this constant state of worrying, oh my gosh, I really need to get an A on my next exam, and then as soon as you do get an A or a B or what have you on your next exam, then you're like, oh gosh, but now the final, I've got to do well on the final too, so that my midterm exam counts as well, and that's just miserable. So Schopenhauer thinks that art is one of the very few things that can jolt us out of this otherwise miserable existence. And so now the question is, well, gosh, how can art do that? Well, Schopenhauer thinks that by contemplating art, we're able to put ourselves in a new sort of psychological state. That's because when we look at art, when we look at, say, a picture, a painting of a tree, we don't see just an individual tree. Instead, Schopenhauer says we're able to tap in to the idea of a tree itself. And by the idea here, he has something in mind like Plato's ideas or ideal forms, these things that exist outside of space and time and aren't any individual tree, but the very idea of tree-ness. And so Schopenhauer thinks that really good art can allow us to see not just individual trees, but the very idea of tree itself. And now, here's the cool part. It turns out, well, individual trees, those are the sort of things that could possibly satisfy our desires. If you say, I don't know, want to build a tree house, then an actual individual tree could help you provide a place to build your tree house. Or if you need some wood to build your house, then yeah, a tree can help you build that house. Or if you need some shade to get out of the hot sun, then yeah, an individual actual tree can help you there. But you're going to be shit out of luck if all you've got is the idea of treeness. Ideas can't actually satisfy any of your desires. So one thing that happens when we contemplate art is that we get in touch with these pure ideas, and those ideas are just not the sort of thing that we could even hope might satisfy all of these desires and will that we have roiling around inside of us. So now this is the cool thing. Schopenhauer says, okay, so now that we're just contemplating pure ideas when we look at art, we're no longer thinking about how those things we're perceiving might come to help us fulfill our desires or get what we want for ourselves. So that is enough to kind of jolt us out of our, kind of everyday common psychology where we're just like thinking about everything we see in terms of how it might help us get what we want and fulfill our desires. When we contemplate these pure ideas, Schopenhauer says we become this thing that he calls the pure subject of knowing. One way of putting this is he says, look, we become objective in some way. We're no longer this being that goes through the world subjectively thinking about what myself, what I want or what I desire, and looking at other things to figure out how they might help fulfill my desires. No, when we become this pure, will-less subject of knowledge, we get into a state in which we can just appreciate ideas for themselves from this objective stance that has nothing to do with our own individual wills and desires. And in that way, when we contemplate really good art, we have this feeling of beauty. So for Schopenhauer, beauty is the feeling that we get when we contemplate art and we see, say, an image that allows us to see not just an individual thing in that image, but an actual idea. And that puts us into the state of being a pure, will-less subject of knowledge that no longer is obsessing about our desires and what we want, and unfortunately how short we come from fulfilling our desires most of the time. So for Schopenhauer, art is the one thing that can give us a little peace in life, where we can just contemplate ideas in and of themselves without worrying about all of the goals and desires and things that we usually worry about. And beauty is just the feeling that we have when we get put into that pure, will-less state of knowledge. Now, he does a similar analysis of that other aesthetic emotion we've been talking about this week, namely the sublime. So for Schopenhauer, the sublime involves the same sort of process that we get when we look at things that are beautiful, where we are able to contemplate just the pure ideas themselves and become these pure, will-less subjects of knowledge. The difference with things that are sublime is that the things that we're looking at are things that normally would threaten our will by, namely, killing us, for example. So when we look at things like paintings of shipwrecks or, a lion lunging at its prey, those are the sort of things that could totally mess with our desires, because, it would rip out our ability to have any desires at all in the first place, or to, satisfy any of the desires we already have, because we'd be dead. And so Schopenhauer says, look, if you can get into that state of contemplation, where you're contemplating the idea of a lion or the idea of a shipwreck without worrying about whether that shipwreck is going to kill you or that lion is going to attack you, then you're in that contemplative state when we look at beautiful things. But moreover, it's more of a struggle to get there, because you're coming into this contemplative state about something that usually should really make your will and your desires go haywire, worrying about how threatening it is to you. So once you do that struggle, you overcome this pull that things like shipwrecks and tigers have on your will, and launch yourself into this pure contemplative state of pure knowledge of an idea. So, notice, Schopenhauer's ideas are very similar to Kant's. His notion of beauty is also, just like Kant, a notion of a disinterested pleasure. It's a pleasure that you have independent of your own personal desires. In fact, for Schopenhauer, perceiving beauty is all about perceiving something and getting yourself away from all of your desires. Wow, someone is having one hell of a party over there, really blasting the music. And then, moreover, with the sublime, his notion of the sublime is very much like Kant's as well, where the notion is that it's a feeling you have once you overcome something that would otherwise be very threatening to you. Either your cognition, your body, or in Schopenhauer's case, it's something that's threatening to your very will itself.